story to carry out another intelligence assignment for the Office of Naval Intelligence and/or the CIA. He returned from the Soviet Union in June of 1962 to Texas, and by far his most mysterious travels, for me at least, was his alleged trip to Mexico City in September of 1963 and alleged visits to both the Soviet and Cuban embassies, events which have probably caused more controversy and speculation than any other of Oswald's more arcane activities. Was he actually there, or was this the work of an imposter? Our panelists for the probe of those questions today are Dick Russell, here on my left, who is a journalist. He is also the author of a book called The Man Who Knew Too Much, not to be confused, by the way, with the Graham Greene book of the same title. This is an examination of the activities and the opinions of Richard Case Nagel, who claims to have interfaced with Oswald during his stay in Japan in the late 50s and in 1962 and 1963 here in the United States. Hal Verb is an assassination researcher who has worked very closely with Harold Weisberg in the past. He has been on television talking about this subject many times. He taught a class on the JFK assassination at the San Francisco State College. And finally, Mary Ferrrell, our keynote speaker, who certainly doesn't need any more introduction. Each panelist will take their turn giving their views on these topics. We're going to start with Hal Verb, and he's going to talk a little bit about Oswald's stay in Japan. Hal?
Yes, thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I was here last year and welcomed the opportunity to attend a convention of this size. Now, I know my time is limited, so I'm going to try to get into my basic overall view. Since my area is Japan, I want to see if I can back up a little and say what I hope to present is a case for Oswald as an agent of the U.S. government. Now, as I see all the fingerprints and all the linkages and tracings and routings of Oswald and his various moves from different locations have all the fingerprints and earmarks of Oswald as an agent of the U.S. government. It's my contention, I think somebody will probably think it's ironic, but this is what I do believe. I think it's probably more that the government would reveal the nature of the assassination and who the conspirators are, and would not reveal the identity and nature of its agents. No government releases the names and agents that works for it. Probably no government in history. I'm not sure about this, maybe a historian could correct me, but I even doubt that Mata Hari, who was a very well-known spy, perhaps the most successful spy in the world, has been identified by that government as an agent of that government. If somebody can correct me on this, I'd be willing to hear it. But essentially the point I'm trying to make is that the fingerprints of Oswald as an agent are very clear. Now, what was he doing at Atsugi? Who is Oswald? Just to back up a little bit, and I'll try to get into this later because I only have a limited time. You will recall that in the alleged interrogation of Oswald, Craig, who I interviewed about this, when Oswald was presented as the case developed, one of the points he made, now everybody will know who I am. I asked Craig specifically, I looked him square in the eye, what do you think he meant by this? He said, well, he was blowing his cover. Cover meant, of course, government credentials. This Craig was, in my view, pretty firm about. Remember, this is the day of the assassination. Now, what was Atsugi? What happened at Atsugi? As you well know, it's well established now, there was a CIA overflight base. From that base, the famous U-2 plane was shot down. I may be incorrect, it may not have flown out of that base, but certainly the U-2 was flying out of that base. Oswald had an electronic MOS background. MOS, in case any of you do not know, is military occupational specialty. I had a military occupational specialty when I was in the Army of intelligence section. on a very minor level. So those of you who have been in the Army and Marine Corps know that there are MOSs. The significance of Oswald having an MOS can be spelled out by a letter here I have, which was received by a researcher who is fairly well known in the field. He is a writer. Anyway, I will just give you some of the excerpts. This is from a letter from somebody who apparently was stationed at the base at the same time as Oswald. I have prepared a list, which I sent to the third decade, of all the people who I could round up who were at Atsugi and also at El Toro. That is all the barracks roommates and associates of Marine Corps Lee Harvey Oswald. Much better than legend, which Epstein has developed in his book, which is very limited. If you'll see, he does list the associates of Oswald in El Toro and Atsugi. My list is much more comprehensive. If any of you are interested in this list, I'd be willing to give you details. You can see me about it later. The third decade has it, Harold Weisberg has it, and I definitely would be willing to have this in the hands of the investigators. Anyway, let me get down to this letter. These are excerpts now. A very cursory investigation would show that NAS Atsugi, NAS stands for Naval Air Station Atsugi, was used for staging RB-29s. That is a plane that was used for overflights. This was a modified B-29. It was used for electronic intelligence and was the equivalent of an airborne Pueblo. You all know what the Pueblo was. The ship that was in the Korean incident. If not, I'll be willing to tell you about that later. A person with Oswald's electronic MOS could hardly be unaware of the purpose of the missions at a time when they were deemed secret. The letter goes on to say, the personnel in the Air Communication and Air Controllers Unit were, by the very nature of their work, constantly exposed to the type of off-base information that caused ONI, I emphasize that, and CIC to continually remonstrate with them about the security of their information. And it is a fact that the officers and senior NCOs used all kinds of gimmicks with passes and parties to encourage them to stick together and limit contact with the rest of us. Oswald was assigned to the controllers according to the later reports. If anyone knew what MITO was, they did. MITO are initials of an operation that was going on. I've been looking for somebody to come forth for many years to identify what those initials mean. If anybody here has had any Marine Corps, Air Force experience, I even discussed this with an Air Force general who was a friend of President Kennedy. In fact, I will get into the discussion I had with Kennedy because at that time they were discussing, believe it or not, the war in Vietnam, which I think has significance. May have significance to those people who claim that Kennedy was shot because he was getting into a war in Vietnam and he wasn't proceeding according to the way the conspirators want. Anyway, let me continue. By the way, I think that MITO stands for, this is just my way of looking at it, METL. What are the initials? It's my feeling that the initials stand for Marines, Electronics, Tactical, or perhaps Technical Operations. In other words, a very high security operation going on out of Japan and Atsugi. Okay, I'll end this letter. It is a fact that various undercover types were floundering around in the barracks and in the hangars from time to time checking on security, but this was usually a joke for those who thought. They were always so obvious, and their temporary designations were a giveaway every time. It is also true that one or two permanent types were on the scene. That's the end of the letter. I might emphasize the point about temporary designations. That is what they call in the service TDY. I'm sure if anybody here was in the Army or Marine Corps, you know what TDY stands for temporary duty. Now I had occasion when I was in the Army to meet somebody who was in TDY who was with the CID. I want to get more into that later, but I'll just tell you very briefly what happened. There was an incident, and I don't want to run over time because I know other people have important things to say. There was an incident that happened on my base. I was stationed in Panama, where a soldier who had participated in the Korean War went berserk one day and manned a machine gun post out in the jungle, and he just went berserk and started firing. Our base commander crawled on his stomach to overcome the person who had been, who had obviously gone crazy. In any event, I was after taking a shower on the base one night, somebody came up to me who was in the base. He'd just been, quote, TDY. He identified himself. He says, since I know you're in intelligence, I guess I can discuss with you, but I'm with the CID, which of course is a body that spies on soldiers who are in a base. I never even knew this. He volunteered the information. The only reason he volunteered the information was because I was connected to an intelligence section. Anyway, the main point I'm trying to bring up here, and I could also connect this with other clearance that Oswald had, which I'll develop later as time goes on. Oswald at El Toro Air Base, where he was stationed as a Marine Corps, when he applied for a hardship discharge, also had what was known as crypto-secret clearance. I'll get into that later, but my main point is to show that Oswald had all the fingerprints and credentials of an intelligence agent, and this helps explain many of the reasons why the government will not release files that connect to the security files relating to Oswald, the Marine Corps, CIA files, and whatever. That's my main point. I'll get into other areas later with the questions and perhaps from the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Hal. All right, now we're going to hear from Dick Russell, who's going to talk a little bit about Oswald's stay in Russia.
Thank you, Bob. I guess I should preface this by telling you just a little bit about the primary source, probably 60% of the book that I've written that will be coming out next month. The Man Who Knew Too Much is about Richard K. Snagel. Both Jim Garrison and Bernard Fensterwald Jr. Believe that, as I do, that Richard Nagel is probably the most important living witness in terms of the events leading up to the death of the president that there is. He's still alive. I met him in 1975 as a journalist. A story I won't tell you in great detail now, but I maintained a relationship with him off and on over a period of years. I waited a long, long time to tell what I know of his story in hopes that eventually he would tell me everything he knew. He never did. He never provided certain documentary evidence that I believe he has that's really kept him alive since he stashed it away. That would have perhaps moved this case forward in a way that far beyond any of our dreams. But I decided earlier this year, after Oliver Stone's movie came out, that I should put on the historical record what I do know about him, and so I have. Just in brief, he was the youngest soldier promoted to captain during the Korean War to receive a battlefield commission. He was a military intelligence officer during the 1950s in the Far East, which is where he met Lee Harvey Oswald for the first time. And he was a CIA contract agent in 1962 and 63 when he became involved with Oswald once again. I think Hal is exactly right. The fingerprints of intelligence are all over Oswald. I will preface briefly some of the material that I've written about Russia with Japan because, according to Richard Nagel, there was in late 1957 in Japan a defection plan wherein the CIA was trying to get a Soviet colonel with the GRU, which is the Soviet military intelligence equivalent, to defect. He was a high-ranking colonel at the Soviet embassy in Tokyo. His name was Nikolai Eroshkin. And Nagel was involved in a plan which was allegedly authorized by Desmond Fitzgerald, who was then the head of the Far Eastern Division of the CIA, to bring this man over to the American side. Sometime, I believe during that period, the fall of 1957, Oswald was observed by the Japanese National Police walking up and down in front of the Soviet embassy in Tokyo. He then entered the embassy. The Japanese police took a picture of him going in, and while in the embassy, he met with Colonel Eroshkin, the same man that the CIA was trying to get to defect. Nagel met Oswald after that, arranged through a source in the Japanese police to be introduced to him under an assumed name. Later introduced him to someone else who was involved with the CIA in this defection plan, who was a Japanese scholar and professor emeritus at Tokyo University, whose history goes all the way back to the League of Nations. Oswald met with this Japanese scholar as well. So what I'm saying is that you have, and this is the first time I've ever told this story publicly. It's in the book. I don't know how sensitive it still is as far as what the CIA is concerned about. But you have Oswald in touch with, meeting with two people who are involved in this plan, defection plan, in Tokyo in the late 50s. According to Richard Nagel, when Oswald defected, quote unquote, to Russia in 1959, he was already suspected by the Soviets, ever since the day he walked into their embassy in Tokyo, of being an agent of one of the U.S. intelligence services. So the question arises, why does the KGB let him stay? If they believe he's an agent, why don't they kick him out, court-martial, not court-martial him, but do something to him. Instead, what you have a situation where initially the Soviets were going to throw Oswald out, and then suddenly Nightline reveals last year, Nightline got access to some of the files that the KGB maintained on Oswald. And on the program, they had a thing that really struck me, which was orders from Anastas Mikoyan, who was number 2 to Khrushchev, to reconsider, for the KGB to reconsider their position concerning this, lowly Marine defector. And in fact, they did not throw him out. They set him up in Minsk in a very nice apartment where he eventually met Marina. He lived quite well, was given a job in the Belarusian radio and television factory in electronics. And again, the question is why? What's really going on? Why are the Soviets treating this guy so well if they think he might be an American spy? And what I believe it has to do with is something that I think follows Oswald from Tokyo all the way probably up until the day of his death. And that is what becomes what you might even call peripheral. I believe it's peripheral to the assassination itself. But there is an intelligence operation going on in which the CIA and the KGB are both involved, and both involved with this young man for reasons, that I certainly don't claim to know all of them. But that it has to do with perhaps watching Oswald to see who's in touch with him, to find out who's working for who, with the whole mole question that we've heard about. Has the KGB penetrated the CIA at a certain level? The CIA was certainly trying to do that with the KGB as well. And I think this has a lot to do with who Oswald was and why we still can't get a lot of the files about it. Particularly, and I'll just mention this and maybe running out of time, so we'll talk about Mexico more later, but when Oswald went to work at the Minsk radio and TV factory, if he was in fact working for CIA and somehow getting reports out or to the United States, the man who would have analyzed those reports in Washington, D.C. was a fellow named John Paisley, who was then the head of the Soviet electronics branch in the CIA's Office of Research and Reports. John Paisley is a fascinating figure whose name has never really come up in terms of the assassination, but in 1978, when the House Assassinations Committee was doing its investigation, the day after Richard Helms testified, Richard Helms was director of CIA in the 60s, about Yuri Nasenko, who was the defector who came over from Russia almost immediately after the assassination, saying, "I'm coming to the West, I handled Oswald's file, the Russians, the KGB had nothing to do with it." The day after that Nasenko testimony, Nasenko was held in captivity for 3 years. It's probably a story many of you are familiar with, and I won't get into it all here, but John Paisley was sailing in the Chesapeake Bay. At that time, he was deputy director for strategic research for the CIA. Disappeared off of his yacht. His body, supposedly his body, was found about 2 weeks later. And according to a lot of research that's been done on him independently, and according to what Richard Nagel told me almost immediately, John Paisley was, in fact, for many years, a KGB mole inside the CIA. So, the situation then would be, the KGB, if this is true, and if the KGB knows that Oswald's reports out of Russia are going to be analyzed by Paisley, who's in fact working for them, then of course they set him up in the radio factory, they don't kick him out, they know he's working for CIA, maybe he doesn't know much of anything about, who's on the other end of his reports, but did the mic just go there? But anyway, that's a situation that makes, I don't know why it's gone off. Hello? Got it? Is it working now? Okay. Anyway, I guess I'll stop at that for the moment. We'll get into Mexico City shortly, and Mary, I guess, will tell us a little bit about that at this point, and then we'll go on from there and get to your questions too before too long.
I wanted to add one thing about the Russian episode. When Lee left New Orleans in September of 19, is the mic not on?
It's not on.
I beg your pardon?
No button.
That might be it. Is it working?
Hello? No?
No, they're off.
Huh? Yeah. Okay.
If we speak up about it at this level here, can you folks hear us at the back? What? Oh.
Floor mic? Should we check the floor mic? Okay. Nope.
Now I think it's, can you hear me now?
Here we go.
Okay, here we go. Go ahead, Mary.
When Lee Oswald left for Russia, went from Dallas Fort Worth to New Orleans, and then from there to La Havre and on to Southampton and Helsinki and on to Russia. In 1959, when he got to Russia in October, I believe October 11th or 12th of 1959, from that point on, he was virtually out of contact with his mother and brother. They heard nothing from him. In December of 1960, after more than a year of hearing nothing from her son, Marguerite Oswald made a trip to the State Department in Washington. She demanded to see Secretary of State Dean Rusk. She was not granted an audience with Dean Rusk, but she did speak with an assistant. She, in a very shrill tone, demanded that they put her in touch with her son. She said, he is an agent for you people. He is working for his government. I know I can hear from him. You can see to this. 4 days later, Lee wrote a letter to his mother. The first communication in more than a year. Now, in this letter, he states, I wrote you a letter a certain day 2 weeks ago. How does he know she didn't receive that letter? So I believe that the State Department said this woman is going to start screaming to the press that her son is an agent. Get him to write to her. Just get him in touch with her, which happened. And that's a supposition on my part that they did. It may be just a real coincidence. Another thing is that immediately after the assassination, Bob Dorff and I seem to be the only one of the many. Why don't you tell that, Bob?
His last name, anyway, his name is Bob, and I think his last name is Baird. And maybe some of you, Jerry, or some of the other people in the audience might hopefully remember this. It was either Friday evening, just after dusk, or Saturday evening, one of those 2 days, on the 22nd or the 23rd of November. And I remember a camera angle shooting down at the steps and the sidewalk in front of, which building was that?
The City Hall.
The City Hall building. And several reporters were there with mics, and they were interviewing Marguerite Oswald, Lee's mother. And one of the reporters said to Marguerite, why would your son want to kill our president? And she said, well, my son wouldn't kill the president. He works for the government. He's been working for the government for years. Does anybody in the audience remember seeing that? I don't see any hands. So it's very strange, because this isn't maybe, this isn't I think I remember, this is absolutely to a mortal certainty that Mary and I both remember this. And we can't find anyone outside of this one man in California who saw it then, and we can't find anybody who ever saw it again. And that's, I think, an extremely unusual situation, considering the implications of a statement like that.
Well, excuse me, can I add something to that relates both to Lee Harvey Oswald and both Marguerite Oswald? I was on a radio program in December 1966 in Oakland, California, discussing the Kennedy assassination, and Harold Weisberg was at the tail end of the program. We spoke for about 3 or 4 hours on the program. It was probably the first big break for getting our point of view about what happened, what occurred during the assassination. Anyway, at the very end of the program, a call came in. The person only wanted to talk to Harold Weisberg because Harold had very good credentials. He had been in the government, he had worked in the OSS, and he had been a documentation specialist, and he spelled all this out, I'm sure, in the program. Anyway, he only wanted to speak to Harold. Fortunately, I was able to hear the whole conversation by the announcer who allowed me to listen in. He said, Hal, this is important. I think you should listen in. Well, he thought it was important. I think it was very significant. The caller said, and I have a feeling that he lived somewhere in the area where I live. The caller said that he was a barracks roommate of Lee Harvey Oswald at El Toro. That, in fact, he knew him quite well to engage in kind of activities with him, either on the base or off the base. From things that I've read subsequently, what he knew about Oswald doing turns out to be true. It was one of the activities he engaged in. To get to the bottom line of what he said that Oswald had a crypto-secret clearance. A crypto-secret clearance is a very high intelligence clearance. At the Marine Corps base at El Toro, he was known to have been a reader of a Communist Party publication, and in fact, his Marine Corps associates used to kid him about being a Russian. I think they called him Oswaldovich. But anyway, he went on to say, not only did he have a crypto secret clearance, but about 2 weeks prior to his getting his alleged hardship discharge, when Marguerite Oswald had an injury, which was a very minor injury, very minor injury, he was constantly in the CID office, Criminal Intelligence Division, constantly in that office for 2 weeks steadily, being briefed, according to this caller, for a mission overseas, a secret mission overseas. You all know what occurred. It is my belief that it was under the ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence. And why the ONI? Because the ONI had a defector program, which has been suggested in various articles in different books. Summers' book relates to it. There's the David Bucknell incident, which I myself have not confirmed, but certainly it lends allegation to the point that Oswald was working as an agent of the U.S. government. Remember, here he is, he's being briefed for a mission. Mrs. Marguerite Oswald later said, I was so surprised. Here he's applying for a hardship discharge, and then suddenly he's in Russia.
Mary, if you want to...
Marguerite had a candy box. She worked at Cox's department store in Fort Worth, and there was she worked for the candy company, King's Candy Company. And in December of 1958, a box fell, a candy box, and I asked her what size box was it. I wanted to know, was it a big carton of boxes? It was a candy box, fell and hit her nose. She never even sought medical attention for it. And yet, in August of 1959, he got a hardship discharge to go home and take care of his mother, who had been injured when a box fell on her nose. Now, this had happened in December of 1958. She didn't even consult a doctor about it. And then in August, he applied for a hardship discharge to take care of her. On September the 4th, he went to Santa Ana, not discharged, and he applied for a passport to go to, among other places, Russia. And the passport is issued on September 10th to go to Russia while he is still a United States Marine. He is discharged the next day. He goes to Fort Worth, Dallas, goes to Fort Worth to his mother's. She went to her landlord and borrowed a cot for her son to sleep on. It'll just be 2 or 3 days. He will only be here 2 or 3 days. And he ends up, I'm not sure she knew that he was going to Russia, but he did go to Russia. And nobody knew where he had gone. This was kept very, other than the passport. But his first cousin, Marilyn Dorothea Murad, who worked her way around the world teaching school, ran into Lee's half-brother, John Pick, in Japan in early October of 1959, and John Pick said to his cousin, "Do you ever hear from Lee?" And she said, "Oh, he's in Russia. Hadn't you heard?" How did this woman, who is working her way, there's been a lot of speculation that she is the one who recruited him for service. There was a document concerning Marilyn Dorothea Murad and Harold R. Isaacs, who was a government, certainly, I would say, at the very least, he was an asset for intelligence. He was at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There was a document that was classified for many, many years. Now, that document, when we finally got it didn't even mention Marilyn Dorothea Murad, which makes me think the document had been substituted. We know they did substitute documents. Richard Helms substituted a document that was printed in the 26 volumes, a document that said about the Mexico City trip. They didn't dream when they gave these affidavits to the Borrowing Commission that they were going to print any of them. So when they're ready to publish the 26 volumes and they have to get clearance, Richard Helms looked at this document saying these pictures of the unidentified man, CE 237, are Oswald. Not the pictures, I'm sorry. That Oswald had appeared at the Soviet embassy on these certain dates. The document he signed gave the exact dates. And Richard Helms, we didn't know all of this until 1976 when we started getting releases from the CIA, and those are the most important documents. They're now in the National Archives. Those are the ones we must force from the government. This document was about to be published, and Richard Helms said, no, you can't publish that. Let me substitute a document. Now, how many documents have been substituted for the real ones? And this document that appears in the volumes, in 26 volumes, I believe it's in volume 26. No, it appears in there from Richard Helms, the affidavit that says this picture was made outside the Soviet embassy sometime between November 20, go back 9 months, and November 22nd. Gave a 9-month period. He had already given an affidavit pinpointing the dates. And changed.
Mary, so that we do get into just the core stuff about Mexico City, why don't you, because I know you have a good outline up there, why don't you just tell us just the barest bones of he came, he went here, he went there, he came home?
Well, there's speculation both ways. There are a lot of people feel that that Lee Harvey Oswald did not go to Mexico City, that an imposter went. There are probably more people who think that Lee did go, that in fact he made 2 trips. Now, we are not sure that there's no documentation for his having made a former trip, just as they tried to say that Jack Ruby never went. Well, we know now that he made several trips. But Lee, on the bus going to Mexico City in September, there were 2 Australian girls who were, for the first time, they had been to the States and were going to Mexico, and he sat near them. And he advised these girls to stay at the Hotel Cuba. I have stayed there before. It is so many blocks from the Palace of Fine Arts. Now, the Hotel Cuba, what really was in this position in Mexico City. So, whoever this man was, and these 2 Australian girls identified the Lee Harvey Oswald from Fort Worth as the one who sat by them on the bus. This man, from the things he said to them, giving them advice of what to see and what to do, I believe that man had been to Cuba, to Mexico City before. Now, during the time he is there, the CIA had, why don't you tell me? It's about the CIA cameras.
Okay, one of the things which I think bears a lot of scrutiny in terms of whether Oswald actually was at the Cuban or the Soviet embassy has to do with the fact that one of the investigators, the staff investigators and researchers for the House Assassinations Committee, a man named Edwin Lopez, went down to Mexico City for the HSCA, and he interviewed Sylvia Duran. He interviewed a lot of the other personnel who had worked at the embassies, the ones that would talk to him, the ones from the Russian embassy wouldn't talk to him. He also interviewed the translators who allegedly translated the famous call from the Cuban embassy to the Soviet embassy. And most importantly, he was able to get a film from the CIA intelligence officers. All foreign embassies are surveilled by American intelligence. Everybody knows this. This is not any great secret. He determined that 2 cameras were functioning in the front entrance to the Cuban embassy and 1 to the back entrance of the Cuban embassy. He determined from looking at the negatives, from which there were no spaces missing, from June through October, the end of October 1963, and found no picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. The reason that we think that is so significant is that if, in fact, he had been to the embassy, and if, in fact, they were trying to implicate the real Lee Harvey Oswald, we are relatively certain that the CIA would be delighted to hand you a picture of him. The fact that they have no picture of him, we feel, is very, very important and suspicious. Now, Dick Russell has something to add to this about another alleged picture of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, there's a lot of things about Mexico City. The House Committee apparently, well, I'm not sure where to start. Let me start first with the fact of 2 trips. I believe Oswald did make 2 trips to Mexico. Mary mentioned the girls on the bus talking about the Hotel Cuba. I got interested in the possibility of the 2 trips because Richard Nagel had told the FBI, and it's in an FBI file, in December of '63 that he had met Oswald in Mexico and in Texas. Tony Summers, when he was researching his book, heard from Guy Bannister's secretary in New Orleans. Bannister was a right-wing fanatic there. Many of you have heard of him, I'm sure. That Oswald had made a trip to Mexico in the summer of 1963. I came across a file in the Time Life Library archive from 1975, which again talks about Oswald having made 2 trips to Mexico. I interviewed 2 people who were there in Mexico City at the time, Clark Anderson, who was the FBI's legal attaché, and Thomas Mann, who was the ambassador to Mexico at the time. Both of them had conceded that they had heard rumors that Oswald had been there more than once. And then I'll tell you real briefly the story of a guy who was a bullfighter there at the time named Robert Clayton Buick. Still around. He'd been a bullfighter in Mexico between 60 and 65 and frequented a bar that I had come across through Nagel called the Hotel Luma, in the Hotel Luma, and told me this incredible story about how sometime in the spring of '63 or the early summer, he was walking out of this bar one night, and these 2 guys, he sensed them on his trail. They were following him. He ducked down an alley, came out, put a gun against one of their heads and said, you know, what the hell are you doing? They identified themselves as intelligence agents, told him that they wanted him, since he was, you know, got around, knew a lot of people, to shadow certain people who were frequenting the Hotel Luma in Mexico City. So he did, and told me that in the summer of '63, he encountered a young guy who told him that he wanted to be a bullfighter. And he said he called himself Alex something. Well, the name that he used was Alex Heidel. That was an alias that Oswald used continually, off and on. It's the name he ordered the rifle under, the famous Mannlicher Carcano. And then he said, then this guy came up to me again. Of course, it meant nothing to him at the time, and used a different name. So he thought, hey, there's something going on here. And then the guy started talking ideology. Anyway, the point being that this was, he said, in the summer of 1963, not in September. Something very weird was going on in Mexico. Station chief in Mexico City was a man named Winston Scott, about whom very little is still known to this day. I managed to find out quite a bit about him. Again, it's sort of a long story, but I'll summarize it as much as I can. Winston Scott retired. He was station chief in Mexico City for 14 years, between 1955 and 1969, at which time he retired, stayed on in Mexico, and set up a company called Diversified Corporate Services. He also began working on a manuscript, or a memoir, which took him a couple of years, and even his family didn't really know what it was about. They thought maybe it was a history of intelligence gathering. Anyway, suddenly, he finished the manuscript, and suddenly, I believe in April or March, I can't remember which exactly, of 1971, Winston Scott died. He fell off a wall in his backyard, went to a hospital, the doctor said he was okay. Apparently had a heart attack at the table, at his breakfast table on a Monday morning. Immediately, James Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA for many years, flew from Washington to Mexico City, ostensibly to attend Winston Scott's funeral. But what he really was coming for was this manuscript, among other things. Those other things, including, I was told by one source who should know, not the main source of my book, but someone else, a sound recording of Lee Harvey Oswald's voice, which Scott had kept since November 22nd, 1963, since before then. That there was also a photograph of Oswald that Scott had. I was told, he kept files in the old FBI way. He never threw anything out. He had vast files from his days at the CIA, and he kept a lot of things at home. Angleton was so concerned, or someone at the CIA at least was so concerned about what Scott might have or what might go public, that Angleton was sent to retrieve absolutely everything. But what he really wanted was this manuscript, and he told members of Scott's family, you know, I want this manuscript and I want it now. And they didn't even know exactly what he was talking about. They couldn't find it. It took 3 days. Apparently a secretary who had typed it was severely questioned about it as well. But Angleton eventually got it. A few years later, well, I guess it was about 10 years later, the station chief's son set out to obtain a copy of that manuscript and approached the CIA about it. He went to Washington. He was finally invited to come to Langley, Virginia, and meet with the CIA people about it. And they sat down, and a very high-ranking official said to him, well, we had great respect for your father. He was an incredible man. But we cannot release to you on grounds of national security this entire manuscript. And what they did was they handed him across pages with everything from 1947 on blanked out. And the son said, well, I thought this was, my dad's private, wanted this to see the light of day. And he was told, so the son told me, that there was something about Lee Harvey Oswald in that manuscript that the CIA could not afford to make public. There's a lot more that we could talk about Oswald in Mexico, and certainly if you have questions for...
We'll get to the questions in just a minute, but there are a couple of other things that I think tie in very closely with what you're talking about that we ought to cover. Mary, why don't you go into the thing about Phillips and the testimony about having the assets inside the Cuban embassy.
Phillips, David Atlee Phillips, made in his testimony to the House Select Committee, said that they had 2 assets inside the Cuban embassy, and he was not talking about Sylvia Duran. That would have been our first supposition. I feel that Luisa Calderon was one of those. In fact, I'm almost certain, because on November 14th, 1963, and she was not due to be returned to Cuba, she was suddenly called back to Cuba because, quote, her father was ill. Now, we now have evidence that it was not her father's illness. In fact, when the CIA documents, the ones that we do have, were released in 1976, we believe that she was threatened. They almost put her to death. They thought she had been working for the United States government, and she probably was. We don't know who the other one was, but
another narrative about this same subject, which is so important. The only piece of evidence, the only credible piece of evidence that Oswald had actually been to the Cuban embassy is an application for a transit visa that he made during the latter part of September while he was there, and in early October, I think the 1st or the 2nd, and he came home by the 3rd to Dallas. The application is critical because, according to handwriting experts, the signature is definitely Oswald's signature, and the picture is definitely a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. The significance of David Phillips' testimony, which has never really been released, I read a summary of that testimony. And the fact that they had 2 assets inside the Cuban embassy goes to the issue of the identification, the original identification of Oswald by Sylvia Duran, the secretary at the Cuban embassy who actually made out the application and dealt with Oswald while he was there. What she did on November the 22nd is she heard a radio broadcast which identified the suspected killer of President Kennedy as a man named Oswald, who had spent a lot of time as a defector in Russia and had recently returned with a Russian wife named Marina. That triggered her remembrance, which wasn't that long, it was only 2.5, 3 months earlier, of the man who came to see her for the transit application, which had been the transit visa application, which had caused so much trouble while he was there. On her way to the embassy, she saw a newspaper the next morning, which had a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. She took the newspaper to the file at her office at the consulate, and she opened the drawer of the file and she picked out the application and matched the picture on the application to the picture in the newspaper of Oswald. The point that we're making here, or that we are supposing could be true, is with 2 assets inside the Cuban embassy working for the agency, how easy it would have been to put the application that Sylvia Duran found in the filing cabinet long after or shortly after or whenever it was that they replaced it with the one having Oswald's picture. Aside from that piece of evidence, there isn't one credible piece of evidence that Oswald was ever at the Cuban embassy.
One important thing about this application, when we're told by Sylvia Duran that when this young man came in and made application for the visa, or to the transit visa, he was told you have to have a photograph, and he did not have a photograph. Supposedly, Lee Harvey Oswald left her and went out into Mexico City, and within an hour is back with the little photograph that we see pictured in all the volumes and books of a man wearing with a tie and a light-colored, probably a sweater. The FBI used all its resources to check every photography place, even these like we used to have in 10-cent stores where you stuck a quarter in and you got 4 pictures out, which is what this looks like it is that time. There was no place within 150 miles of Mexico City where that picture was taken. Nobody had that picture, which lends credence to his supposition that someone between the time that this man was there, because Sylvia Duran they gave a different description of the man she interviewed.
Later, after the original identification.
But when it's so plausible that someone put this picture of Oswald in the file.
Yeah, and I think you meant to say that there was no paper of that type that was found by the FBI within
They
150
couldn't
miles.
even,
Yeah.
they couldn't find.
The photographic paper
I
that
mean,
the
you
picture
know
was
that.
printed on.
Mary makes a very good point, because objections by people who support the Warren Commission and people who are trying to find flaws in this argument will say, well, if Oswald left and he came back and signed this, it must have been him because his signature is real. But if you had somebody in the embassy making a switch, that would help explain that. And so it's a very plausible, certainly not 100% proof, but certainly a highly plausible. Can I just continue my one further piece of evidence that Oswald was an agent working for the government? As many of you researchers know, Oswald was in New Orleans in August of 1963, and he was distributing literature for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Hands Off Cuba. You are all familiar with this, and he had a hassle and fight with Carlos Bringuier, who was with the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the CIA front, an organization, exile organization, which previously had been involved in activities including the invasion of Cuba. So because of this, TV cameras which were around, eventually this led to Oswald appearing on a radio station in which he was being asked questions about his activities with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. During the program, as many of you people are familiar with, the testimony of what took place in this radio appearance appears in the volumes, but not to a 100% degree, and I'll get into that in a minute. The questioner raises this point with Oswald. Oswald has explained why the Fair Play for Cuba Committee exists, who he is, and what members he's trying to attract, and the reasons for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee existing. Then the moderator says, Mr. Oswald, we have here in my hands a newspaper article that suggests and says that you were a defector to Russia. What do you have to say about this? And he pauses for a moment. I don't have the exact words, but he says something like, well, now that you have asked me this question, I will answer it. I was under the protection of the U.S. government. I mean to say I was not under the protection of the U.S. government. He made a slip, I think a very significant slip. I was the one who discovered that slip. How did I discover that slip? A friend of mine gave me a record called The President Speaks. It was a record made by none other than a group called the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, which was, guess who was listed on the label? Carlos Bringuier. This is a CIA front organization. Anyway, my immediate feeling was, I had a gut feeling that if I ran to the volumes, that phrase would be left out where he said, I was under the protection of the U.S. government. Sure enough, and I had a transcript, I taped the entire program. Sure enough, that was the part that they left out. The only part that they left out of the entire testimony, they included the ahs, ers, and uhs, and buts, but left out this very phrase. The commission did not leave it out, but the people who gave the transcript left it out. I don't have to, I'm sure everybody here would have no difficulty trying to establish what agency or group would have left that out.
I think that we, Mary, did you have something?
Without hesitation, exactly what he has said. Without hesitation, Lee said, now that you brought that up, I'll explain it. I was at all times under the protection of the United States government. Well, that is not to say I was under protection, but I was always in touch with it. I was always
permanently in touch.
Yeah.
Always, there was a procedure, I haven't established this, but I know government agents can establish it. O&I works a lot better than most government agencies. But there had to be a procedure in which he had made contacts. Who knows? Letters, telephone calls. I can't establish that. Maybe somebody here can.
We've only got about 20 minutes left, and that's 10 minutes short of what we should have for questions from the audience. So any of you who do have questions, if you would just go over to the mic and tell us who you are and ask the question, we'd be happy to answer it.
Mark Zane from Albany, and one of the many problems we've had with Oswald being over in the Far East, with a mysterious death, sold to our China, Philippines, and Subic Bay. And I'm wondering if anyone from the panelists, and anyone in the audience that you're on, knows any further details about this death, and whether there was a connection with Oswald or not.
Dick, you want to take that?
Yeah, well, I can't say I've looked into it independently of what's been written about it. Martin Schramm had been stationed with Oswald in several different places ever since Oswald entered the Marines. One Marine, I believe it was Donald Camarada, talked about the fact that there had been rumors that there was some connection between Oswald and the death of Private Schramm, whom I believe it was a U-2 area that they were stationed at.
He was in a U-2 supply station area.
And Schramm was on guard duty.
Resupply station.
And supposedly, it's a very strange story. I think the best thing I've ever read about it was in Jerry Rose's third decade, where, you know, it was very odd how, again, could this man have killed himself or accidentally discharged his weapon, which was, you know, a lot of questions about the direction that the shot came from and so on. And all I really know is that it occurred at a very strange time. You know, Oswald had shortly before that supposedly accidentally, he did get shot. I mean, he supposedly shot himself with a .22 Derringer. He was called up on court-martial for that. Not too long after Schramm's death, again, you know, he's taking on the military establishment oh, I remember one other thing about the Schramm incident is that when James Wilcott, and there's some question of how credible he is, but when he testified before the House Select Committee, he said that Oswald had been a CIA agent in Japan, that he was there at the time himself in November 22nd, 1963, when the assassination happened, heard this crypto clearance number that Oswald had, and that the CIA had a handle on him because he killed somebody or something. Now again, I talked to Wilcott about it. You know, I don't know whether I don't see why he'd make a story like that up, but you never know with a lot of these people. But that's what I know.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Art Pineda from Hollywood, California. I'd like to know if any of you know any couple contacts that have recently come up that possibly Oswald got his passport as an export-import version from Shaw's Trade Mart in New Orleans, and also whether the Paynes were requesting information on Oswald back when he was at the Civil Air Patrol in '57.
Mary?
I have the document that CD 212, CD 212 is the document you refer to, and it is my contention that that document is being misread. And as far as, what was the first part of his question, the passport?
Yeah. Well, he was important.
No, he did not say that. He did not use that term. He used it in many cases on applications, but not on there. He was going for study abroad or something like that.
Very quickly, Mary's point about the document being misread, it has been misread by some researchers. When Mrs. Payne is referring to 1957, you get the idea that she is doing this in 1957. No, it's not that she's doing it in 1957. She's merely asking for information that may go back as far as 1957 and forward, so that she's not doing it in 1957. You shouldn't get the notion that Mrs. Payne knows.
This is the cover sheet or the cover clause covering several different incidents, and they have put it together, and someone has read that as though it were saying in 1957 she tried to contact the Lee Harvey Oswald's family. This is not true. Over in the documents you see that she contacted Marina and Lee. Well, he wasn't married in '57. He never heard of Marina, we believe. Your questions?
I have two quick questions. In 1959, Oswald's court-martialed twice while at Atsuki, and he is isolated for 28 days from his people. And that's about a month and a half before he goes back to the United States. Do we know anything about what happened while he was under that detainment?
Right. There's some question whether he was ever even in the brig at all. I mean, I think only one Marine who was around reported ever having, seen him there or something. There's a lot of, questions of when he was shipped back from Taiwan, because he had his statement said, but he had venereal disease, right? It said origin in line of duty. Now, what the hell does that mean? But do you know anything more?
Very quickly, in order to answer that, since I do have the records of all the Marine, well, not the records, but the names of all the Marine Corps associates, the best thing to do, if you want to do a project, is you can contact me. I can give you the names of the Marines, can do some further research, but nothing else other than what is known in the CD documents, FBI reports, Warren report. I know that Mary doesn't have anything further than that, I don't think so. But nobody has done any research on it, but if you want to do a project, you can see me later.
Second question. Anthony Summers talks about the mysterious Robert Webster and his defection to the Soviet Union right in line with Oswald's just before, and then his coming back right in line with Oswald's coming back. Can you tell us more about Robert Webster?
There were several who defected in 59 and came back, repatriated in 61 and 62. So that was not, I mean, we seem to have a rash of them. And this ONI defector program, I've wondered if it had anything to do with that.
And the fact that Robert Webster apparently, says Summers, was staying at a rest home that Marina Oswald was in October 60.
Hotel.
The only thing that has ever seemed very strange to me about Robert Edward Webster and the Lee Harvey Oswald story, Robert Edward Webster went over to Russia with the Rand Corporation to help with the international exhibit there. Years later, in 1963, I guess it was 63, Marina was staying with Katya Ford, Declan and Katya Ford. Katya was of Russian origin, and she was staying there. And Katya testified, that's not testified, she gave an affidavit to the FBI that I once asked Marina, what in the world did Lee go to Russia for? And she said he went to work for the American Exposition, which I've asked Marina about. Where did you hear about that? Because she's got her story. I mean, the story is that this is Webster.
Excuse me, can I just make just one brief point about this? This squares with my understanding that the reason that Oswald went to Russia under a defection ONI covered program was he was to learn about the commercial, financial, industrial techniques that were done in Russia, plus know something about the Russian people and submit reports. In other words, he was a mid-level operative. He was not a high-level operative. He was what other operatives were doing throughout the world.
Folks, we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I was supposed to caution people, one question per questioner, and let's limit the responses to.
I have one question. Rich Scheck from Thousand Oaks, California. The photograph that was released of the chunky man, who they identified as Lee Oswald, has any researcher or any public official ever indicated who that was actually?
Nobody knows.
So that's still a mystery.
Yes.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
The reason I think that photograph was submitted is that when the request was put forth with CIA, this is just my interpretation now, is that the request was made and all they did was find out the timing of when Oswald was at the embassy.
That's consistent with what Bob Dorff said.
Yeah.
That time frame where they went over every
Precisely,
photograph.
and that's the significance of that
But was
particular photo.
was the man submitted one of those people in the photograph?
No.
That changed. So there's no idea. No one
Doesn't fit.
No one has any idea.
Absolutely not.
It's conceivable, and I just ask you to consider this, if anybody has ever considered it, talk to me about it, that the mystery man photographed coming out of Mexico City of the embassy is that there are two people. There are a lot of different photographs released coming out of the Cuban and Soviet embassies, and maybe there are two different, quote, mystery men. That's all I'll say.
Gary Aguilar from San Francisco. Again, about the Oswald trip there. Is it certain that in the file in the Cuban embassy that Oswald's photograph there in that embassy, in the Cuban embassy for his application for the transit visa, was really Oswald, number one, and wasn't it that the American assets that were CIA assets that were in the Cuban embassy testified that they never saw the real Oswald in there?
I think that we can dispose of that one very quickly. It was Oswald's picture, and we didn't have the agents who were working for the American government tell us the information that you just mentioned. That was, the controversy was told to the House Select Committee by Sylvia Duran and Asquith, and who was the other fellow? Mirabal, who was replacing Askew. Does that answer it?
About a year ago, I believe that I have this correct, Nightline, it seems to be that Ambassador Strauss, the Democrat who Bush appointed as ambassador in Moscow, came on and said that the most amazing thing happened to him that day, that the head of the KGB came up to him and handed him the file on Lee Harvey Oswald, and indeed brought it back to the United States. Now, subsequently, a number of months later, our CIA chief Gates testified before Congress and said he was opening up the American CIA file on Oswald, or some of it. Well, I guess he said the whole file on Oswald. My question is it possible that the KGB Oswald file got in the hands of our CIA? If so, we'll never see it again. And does anybody have any idea what the status of these two different files are?
Mary?
How did you get it? Does anybody have any idea of the status?
What the status is of the
Both of these files are supposed to have been released
and
to the public.
CIA files, all of the CIA files on Lee Harvey Oswald are now supposedly in the hands of the United States National Archives. Now, whether we ever get them, that will, I doubt that we ever get them. When Gates released all of the files, that consisted of 112 pages, and we have gone through those. Almost every one of them we already had, but with so many deletions that you make no sense out of. So a friend of mine here sat with me over an entire weekend, and it sounds strange that you would take a weekend to go over 112 pages, but we pulled every original released either in April of '76 or in October of '76 or at any time since then. And we compared word for word, and we found many additions that looked innocuous. For one thing, they claim that everybody has a 201 file if the CIA keeps any record of it on. And we see 201 on some of the original documents. It's only when we get these that Gates releases that we see the entire CIA number for Oswald.
And what about the Russian KGB file?
I believe.
That is not completely open, and you can be assured, I doubt very much that they'll open all the files. No government agency releases all files on any agency activity.
Well, what they did was when Nightline went over there, Forrest Sawyer spent 2 months there.
No, I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Robert Strauss said KGB handed him their file.
I think that was to look at. I think it probably.
They've never released it.
That I don't believe at all.
Hi, my name's Cindy McNeil from Baytown, Texas, and my question has to do with Lee Harvey Oswald and E. Howard Hunt being in Japan at the same time. We know E. Howard Hunt went to Japan, Tokyo, in the summer of '54. In his autobiography, he talks about being transferred out of Japan to Uruguay in January of '57. But later in the biography, he talks about having served a 2-year tour of duty in Uruguay. We know his tour of duty was up in March of 1960 when he was put on the Bay of Pigs project. My question is, if he had a 2-year tour of duty, which was up in March of 1960, could that mean that he possibly did not actually leave Japan until '58? And also we know too, he talks about in his biography that he was familiar with the U-2 spy plane program and had been involved in that. I don't think they had one in Uruguay, so it must have been in Japan that he had the information.
I've never looked into that. That's a very interesting question. There's certainly Howard Hunt's name comes up at very curious possible times. I'm not one of those that, whoever thought he was one of the tramps.
Do either of you other two know anything about that?
Well, I would add that when it's alleged that E. Howard Hunt had familiarity with the YouTube program, familiarity is not control or even great depth of knowledge. He could know agents who would talk about overflights and talk about YouTube operations. But the mere fact that he had familiarity, to me, does not suggest anything other than he was a man who was traveling all over the world, from the indication you gave me and other folks. I don't see any great relevance and significance on it.
Even if he were serving in Japan at the same time?
Even in Japan, he traveled from different countries, 2 different countries.
Okay, thank you.
Every time work on the defectors comes up, Robert E. Webster is named as a defector of the same ilk as Oswald. And also, writings also allude to other defectors. I've never seen their names mentioned or any other histories or bona fides on these other guys. Have any of you guys done it? I saw Mary and...
I have all,
Okay,
about 35 of them.
There are a number. I had an article in Jerry Rose's publication, The Third Decade, very good publication, publicized. Right. The first part of this year, and it discussed Priscilla Johnson, a very shadowy, strange career, and it talked about the defectors program in which certain numbers of defectors are mentioned. I urge you to read that article to discuss the whole relevance of what intelligence operations or suggested intelligence operations in which the CIA apparently had a hand. That would help partially explain your question.
Jerry?
Thank you. I'm Jerry Rose, and it's something that wasn't in the third decade, partly because I haven't been able to get the closure that I want on it, and I really appreciate the expertise of the 4 people here, and maybe you can help. It refers to the intelligence implications of course, Mary referred, and a lot of people generally referred to the Oswald's trip to the Soviet Union. I've been particularly interested in the trip back, and particularly the debriefing episodes, either with Space Raven and the Traveler's Aid episode in New York, or even more so the Rotterdam possible debriefing in Holland. And in particular, a lot of incongruity about the travel, the apparently separate travel of Marina and Lee in the course of getting from Russia to Holland. You may know one of the details that Marina has a stamp when she entered Germany, and Lee does not have such a stamp on his passport. Lee, for some inexplicable reason, has an apparent map of the West Berlin airport in his documents, and I wonder if between the 4 of you can help me make anything out of all this.
I just want to address one portion of that, and then I'm sure they have much more to add on other areas. I'm very concerned about the Rotterdam stay. When everywhere that their travel was arranged for them, they stayed in a hotel, and Marina stayed right with him. Rotterdam, they stayed in an apartment, and she claims he was gone. He left this girl with the baby, and he goes out to sightsee. Now, I think it's entirely possible that this is where he was debriefed. We know that the ex-Marine who went to Russia and the CIA became so upset over when he showed up in Michigan at the same time Marina was there, and they didn't want to get them together. Now, I did find this money. We know that he was debriefed on April the 2nd and 3rd of 1961 in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I asked this man, they are saying, what did they do? I believe they debriefed you there. Well, just somebody, the travel agent, somebody met me and they asked me a lot of questions. I think the same thing happened to Lee, but I think it happened in Rotterdam.
I just don't think we can go into any more on that because we're just way over. Next question.
Yes, Peter Novak from Washington, D.C. Yes, a question of when Oswald, they found his Minox camera, and apparently there was 2 frames in there that still were undeveloped, and they said that those frames were of military installations. I was wondering if you know exactly where those military installations were.
Hal, do you know that one?
I have no information on that.
If it's Japan or somewhere else, or Soviet Union.
I don't think they ever determined it.
The answer is we don't know.
Thank you.
I'm Jack White from Fort Worth. I'd like to ask Mary a question and any of the others. that can respond to that might know. In all of the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission and the report itself, only one picture appears as a full-page picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. And the caption under it says, "Photo taken of Oswald in Moscow shortly after his defection." I can prove that this photograph is a composite. Do you have any idea, Mary, where this picture originated? How did the Warren Commission get it? What was the source of it?
I'm sorry, Jack. I remember the one picture that I remember.
This picture right here.
Oh, I do remember. No, I don't know. We've all wondered that, where that came from.
Well, an interesting aspect of that, you're familiar with Fletcher Prouty's story of the newspaper in Christchurch, New Zealand. This is the photograph that also appeared in that newspaper. And I wondered if any of you knew the origin of it.
My guess would be that it would be a foreign news source, which was a CIA asset that would supply the photograph. That's just my guess, knowing previous history of how, papers overseas that are assets would get photographed. That's my guess.
Nope, I have no thoughts on that. Wish I could help.
Okay, I guess that concludes the questioning. Thank you very much for coming. We'll see you next time.